The Berge Panther ground to a halt 300 yards short of the crossroads, and Feldwebel Horst Müller, or someone with his job, because the recovery log from Panzer Brigade 111 doesn't name the crew, stepped out into air that tasted like burning diesel and cordite. 4 Tiger tanks sat in a rough arc across 600 yards of Lorraine farmland, each one trailing black smoke from its engine deck. The date, late September 1944. The place, the rolling fields east of Arracourt, where Patton's Third Army had been slugging it out with German armor for weeks. What stopped the recovery crew cold had nothing to do with the fires they'd seen before. Every man in a Panzer maintenance unit by autumn of '44 had pulled charred hulls off roadsides from Normandy to the Moselle. The problem sat in the geometry. 4 kills spread across open ground, each Tiger hit from a different angle, turrets traversed to different headings, meaning whatever killed them had not sat still. It had moved, fast, and the tracks in the soft earth, narrow and shallow, told a story that didn't match any Allied tank the crew knew. Too light, too fast, with too many direction changes to make sense. No Sherman did this. The recovery report, fragments of which surface in the after-action files of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and in the broader 4th Armored Division records held at the National Archives, offers no German commentary on what they thought had happened. That file stays incomplete. But the physical evidence spoke clearly enough. Something had run circles around 60-ton heavy tanks and killed 4 of them in a single engagement lasting less than 20 minutes. If this kind of deep dive into the fights nobody talks about is why you're here, a like and subscribe, keep these stories coming, and drop a comment. Tell me which battle you want broken down next, because I've got a list and I want to know what matters to you. Now. The American report tells a different story. Same facts, opposite tone. Where the German recovery crew found wreckage and confusion, the 704's records describe something closer to a textbook run. 1 M18 Hellcat, a vehicle most armor officers on both sides considered too thin-skinned for serious tank fighting, had engaged a platoon-strength element of Tiger tanks in open terrain and destroyed all 4. The crew came back with a full ammunition count, minus 4 rounds of 76mm armor-piercing shot. 4 rounds fired, 4 Tigers burning. The after-action summary used the word expeditious. Not heroic or extraordinary. Expeditious, like the crew had completed a maintenance checklist ahead of schedule. To understand how a 19-ton open-top tank destroyer with armor thinner than a half-inch steel plate killed 4 of the most feared tanks in the German arsenal, you have to understand 2 things the Wehrmacht never fully grasped about American armored doctrine. First, the M18 Hellcat carried the same 76mm M1 A2 gun, mounted on late-model Shermans, firing the same ammunition, achieving the same penetration, roughly 4 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at 500 yards. Against the Tiger's side and rear plates, that penetration exceeded the protection by a comfortable margin. The gun could do the job. Second, and this matters more, the Hellcat could do 55 miles per hour on a road and 35 cross-country. The Tiger managed 23 on pavement and half that in mud. The M18 didn't fight like a tank. It fought like a cavalryman on a horse that never tired, appearing, firing, relocating before the Tiger's turret could traverse to track it. The Germans at Arracourt in September 1944 ran headlong into a vehicle designed from the ground up to exploit exactly one advantage: speed that worked as armor. A shell can't hit what isn't there anymore. Panzer Brigade 111 had arrived in Lorraine with fresh Tigers and crews pulled from training units, expecting to smash through Sherman formations with the usual front armor invulnerability that had terrified Allied tankers since Tunisia. They had doctrine for fighting Shermans and doctrine for fighting infantry with bazookas. They had nothing in the playbook for something that moved like a jeep and hit like a tank. The 4 columns of smoke rising over those Lorraine fields marked the moment that gap in their playbook caught fire. 12.5 millimeters. That's how thick the hull armor measured on the production M18. Roughly half an inch of homogeneous steel plate across the front glacis, less on the sides. For context, a standard-issue M1 Garand rifle-firing armor-piercing ammunition could penetrate 12 millimeters of steel at 100 yards. The Hellcat's skin sat right at the margin, where small arms fire became a legitimate threat. A heavy machine gun, the German MG, 42 firing tungsten core rounds, or even a captured American .50 caliber turned back against its makers, could and occasionally did punch through. The turret carried no roof at all, leaving the 5-man crew open to airbursts, mortar fragments, tree splinters from artillery hitting the canopy overhead. Every tanker in the European theater who climbed into a Sherman complained about thin armor. Sherman crews called their vehicle the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter. Lights first time, every time. The Hellcat made the Sherman look like a bank vault. So why did the United States Army deliberately build a combat vehicle this fragile and then send it to fight Tigers? Because a man named Andrew Davis Bruce believed speed killed better than steel, and he had the institutional authority to prove it. Lieutenant General Bruce ran the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center at Camp Hood, Texas, from 1942 onward, and his philosophy boiled down to a sentence that shows up repeatedly in the Tank Destroyer Board's doctrinal publications. The tank destroyer must seek the enemy and destroy him, by fire and maneuver, not by slugfest. Bruce didn't want a better armored Sherman. He wanted a weapon that refused to sit still long enough to need armor. The specifications he drove through Army ground forces demanded a vehicle capable of highway speeds above 50 miles per hour, armed with a gun that could kill any known German tank from the flank, and light enough to be transported by available bridging equipment rated for 20 tons. Armor protection ranked dead last on the priority list, not an oversight, a deliberate, written, underlined decision. The Buick Motor Division of General Motors received the contract in early 1943. Their chief engineer, a man named Harley Earl Jr., son of the legendary GM styling chief who designed the tail fins on the 1948 Cadillac, though that detail has nothing to do with tank destroyers and everything to do with the strange places automotive talent ended up during the war, assembled a team that treated the project less like ordnance engineering and more like building a race car with a cannon bolted to it. The Wright R975 radial engine they selected produced 400 horsepower, originally designed for aircraft use. 400 horsepower pushing 19 tons meant a power-to-weight ratio of 21 horsepower per ton. The Tigers Maybach HL 230P45 produced 700 horsepower but dragged 57 tons behind it, 12.3 horsepower per ton. The Hellcat nearly doubled the Tigers' ratio. Buick's torsion bar suspension, adapted from aircraft landing gear geometry, gave the M18 a ground pressure of 10.5 pounds per square inch. The Tiger pressed 14.8. On the soft clay fields around Arracourt, soaked by weeks of autumn rain, that 4-pound difference meant the Hellcat stayed on top of ground the Tiger sank into. Bruce's tank destroyer doctrine drew its intellectual DNA from an unexpected source, pre-war American cavalry thinking. The 1936 Cavalry Field Manual emphasized that mounted units should avoid decisive engagement with superior forces, and instead strike the flanks and rear, using superior mobility to select the time and place of action. Replace horse with M18 and saber with 76mm gun, and the doctrinal language maps almost word for word. Bruce had served in cavalry units during the interwar period. The connection ran deeper than analogy. The gun was a serious weapon independent of what carried it. The 76mm M1A2 fired the M62 armor-piercing capped ballistic capped round at 2,600 feet per second muzzle velocity. At 500 yards, typical Arracourt engagement range given the rolling terrain and morning fog that characterized those September fights, the round penetrated 116 millimeters of armor at 0 degrees obliquity. The Tiger's side hull measured 82 millimeters. Subtract the angle, account for the slope, and the M62 still carried enough energy to blow clean through and detonate inside the fighting compartment. 1 round, 1 kill, if the crew placed the shot correctly, and placement required getting to the flank. Getting to the flank required speed. Speed required sacrificing armor. The whole design philosophy folded back on itself like a closed loop, each compromise justifying the next, each vulnerability enabling the single capability that mattered. Patton's spearhead had outrun its own blood supply. By September 19th, the 4th Armored Division sat 60 miles east of its nearest fuel dump, with tanks reading quarter full and supply trucks that hadn't arrived in 3 days. The Red Ball Express, that improvised convoy chain running day and night from Normandy's beaches, couldn't stretch fast enough to keep pace with Third Army's sprint across France. Combat Command A held positions around Arracourt, with roughly 100 operational vehicles spread across 15 miles of front. Combat Command B operated to the south near Luneville. Between them, gaps wide enough to drive a Panzer Brigade through without touching either flank. Hitler intended to do exactly that. The 5th Panzer Army's counteroffensive plan called for 2 freshly assembled brigades, Panzer Brigade 111 and Panzer Brigade 113, to punch through the overextended American line, recapture the Moselle crossings, cut Patton's supply corridor at the route, and leave Third Army stranded east of its own logistics. On paper, the force looked formidable. Brigade 111 fielded roughly 45 Panthers and a company of Tigers. Brigade 113 carried a similar mix. Combined, nearly 100 armored vehicles aimed at an American division running on fumes. The Lorraine Plateau handed the Germans one gift they hadn't earned: weather. Starting around September 18th, autumn fog settled into the rolling valleys east of Nancy and refused to lift before mid-morning. Ceiling dropped below 200 feet most days. That fog neutralized the single advantage American commanders feared losing most: the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command, which had been shredding German armor columns in open country since Normandy. With the Jabos grounded, German tanks could move in daylight without watching the sky. For the first time since June, Panzer crews operated under something approaching fair conditions. Fair conditions against a fuel-starved opponent dug into unfamiliar defensive positions. The German staff planners in Manteuffel's headquarters probably liked those odds. They shouldn't have. The terrain around Arracourt rolls in long, gentle swells, not flat enough for the kind of long-range gunnery duels that favored the Tigers 88, not wooded enough to provide consistent concealment for either side. Engagement ranges compressed to between 300 and 800 yards, depending on which fold of ground you occupied. At those distances, the Tigers' legendary frontal armor still mattered, but flanking shots became possible for any vehicle fast enough to use the reverse slopes as cover. The ground created a knife fighter's arena, where reaction time counted more than maximum effective range. The mud mattered as much as the contours. 3 weeks of intermittent rain had turned the clay soil into a consistency that Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion and already building the reputation that would eventually put him in charge of the entire United States Army, described in his situation report simply as impossible. Impossible for what, he didn't specify. His Shermans managed. They bogged down occasionally but kept moving. The German Panthers, heavier by 20 tons, sank to their belly plates in ground the Shermans crossed at speed. The Tigers fared worse. Crews reported losing tracks to the suction effect of deep mud during turns, leaving 57-ton vehicles stranded in open fields with one track thrown and no recovery vehicle close enough to help. Into this mess rolled Panzer Brigade 111 on the morning of September 19th. Green crews in factory-fresh tanks, most of whom had never fought Americans before. Their training had emphasized the Eastern Front model: mass armor on a narrow front, overwhelm with firepower, then exploit whatever broke open. The model assumed an enemy who held static positions and fought back with infantry weapons and towed anti-tank guns. Enemy armor, the thinking went, would meet them head-on in a stand-up engagement where frontal protection decided the outcome. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had other plans. Captain Tom Evans' Company C had positioned its M18s in a shallow tree line along a ridge 2 miles northeast of Arracourt, engines idling, crews scanning the fog with binoculars and listening for the distinctive grinding rumble of German tank transmissions. Evans had drilled his platoons on a rotation doctrine specific to the Hellcat's strengths: fire 1 round, move 200 yards laterally, fire again from the new position. Repeat until the target burned or the crew ran dry. The fog that blinded American fighter bombers worked both ways. A 19-ton vehicle throwing a rooster tail of mud at 35 miles per hour became a sound without a shape, audible, impossible to track through an 88's gunsight. The Panthers came through the fog at 07:30, 10 hours. That's the average seat time logged by replacement drivers assigned to Panzer Brigade 111 before the unit received its movement orders to Lorraine. 10 hours behind the controls of a 45-ton Panther, learning to steer a vehicle with a turning radius of 15 feet on pavement and something closer to wherever the mud decides, on soft ground. The brigade's after-action report, portions of which survived in FMS manuscript B793, compiled by German officers for the U.S. Army Historical Division after the war, lists crew proficiency as inadequate for offensive operations. Their word, not mine. Brigade Commander Oberst Heinrich Bronsart von Schellendorf had built his tactical plan around a single assumption. The Americans defending Arracourt fielded M4 Shermans, 33 tons apiece, armed with the short-barreled 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate a Panther's glacis plate at any combat range. His Tigers would anchor the center, absorbing return fire with 100mm frontal armor, while the Panthers swept both flanks in a classic pincer. The Shermans, outgunned and out-armored, would either retreat or burn. Intelligence summaries passed down from 5th Panzer Army headquarters mentioned American tank destroyer units in the sector, but classified them as towed guns. The M5 3-inch gun on a wheeled carriage, slow to reposition, easy to overrun. Nobody in the brigade's operations section flagged the M18 as a threat category requiring specific countermeasures. The vehicle appeared in German ordnance recognition manuals distributed in mid-44, catalogued under light armored vehicles alongside half-tracks and armored cars. A footnote in the manual noted its high road speed. No tactical guidance accompanied that footnote. The Panther's lights, TZF-12. A gunsight matters here because it explains something about how German crews perceived fast-moving targets. The TZF-12A offered 2.5 times magnification with a 28-degree field of view, excellent for identifying and engaging stationary or slow-moving vehicles at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. But magnification and field of view work against each other when a target crosses laterally at speed. A Hellcat moving at 30 miles per hour across a gunner's front at 400 yards traversed the TZF-12A's full field of view in under 4 seconds. The gunner had to track, lead, and fire within that window, or lose the target entirely behind the sight's edge. The Tiger's hydraulic turret traverse moved the 88 at a maximum of 6 degrees per second, fast enough for Sherman's lumbering at 12 miles cross-country, catastrophically slow for something doing nearly 3 times that speed. Bronsart von Schellendorf's crews had trained against wooden silhouettes and captured T-34s on practice ranges in Germany. The T-34 moved at 33 miles per hour on roads, but rarely exceeded 20 in combat conditions on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armored doctrine emphasized mass over maneuver. A vehicle that actually used its speed as a primary survival mechanism, appearing from a fold in the terrain, firing once, then gone behind the next ridge before the turret caught up, existed outside the combat model these crews had internalized during their 10 hours of familiarization. They expected targets that fought like smaller, weaker versions of themselves. Targets that stood and traded blows. The fog compounded every deficit. Panther commanders rolling through the murk east of Arracourt on the morning of September 19th couldn't see beyond 200 yards in most directions. Standard German armored doctrine called for the lead platoon to halt at the first contact, identify the threat axis, and allow following elements to deploy into battle formation before engaging. That sequence required visual communication between vehicles, flag signals, hand gestures from open hatches, experienced crews reading each other's movements across a battlefield. Green crews in thick fog couldn't execute the choreography. Tanks bunched up on the single paved road, leading toward the American positions, presenting exactly the kind of column formation that a fast-firing flanking weapon could shred from the tree line. Company C's first sergeant later told the battalion intelligence officer that the Panthers came in like they were on parade. The 704th's records preserve that phrase without further comment. Bronsart von Schellendorf lost 11 tanks in the first 90 minutes of contact on September 19th, Panthers and Tigers both, against an American force that suffered 0 vehicle losses in the same period. The brigade's assumptions about what American armor looked like, moved like, fought like, had been built on a model that didn't account for a vehicle the German recognition manual had filed next to half-tracks. The doctrine worked because it violated every instinct a tanker possessed. Armored crews across every army in the war, trained to find cover, stop, aim carefully, and fire from a stable platform. FM 1733, the Tank Destroyer Field Manual published December 1943, inverted that sequence. Move, fire, move again before the enemy's return shot arrives. The stable platform is a dead platform. Staff Sergeant Edwin Gruning's Hellcat sat idling behind a hedgerow 400 yards south of the road, where Bronsart von Schellendorf's column had stalled. The 704th's Daily Unit Journal names vehicles by bumper number rather than crew, so Gruning may or may not have been the crew commander in this particular vehicle. Whoever he was, he had watched 3 Tigers grind to a halt in sequence as the lead vehicle threw its right track, attempting a turn off the paved road onto saturated farmland. The second Tiger stopped to avoid the first. The third stopped because the second blocked its line of advance. 3 57-ton vehicles, motionless, side armor facing south, crews buttoned up and scanning forward through vision slits designed for a 90-degree frontal arc. Nobody looked left. The Hellcat's first round left the 76mm tube at 08:15, according to the battalion fire log. Range, 310 yards. The M62 APC round struck the lead Tiger just behind the forward road wheel, penetrated the 82mm side plate, and detonated inside the hull. Smoke poured from every hatch within 8 seconds. The crew of the second Tiger began traversing their turret toward the sound. 6 degrees per second, through roughly 90 degrees of arc, meant 15 seconds to bring the 88 to bear on the firing position. Gruning's driver had the Hellcat moving before the brass casing hit the turret floor. 35 miles per hour across open ground, throwing mud in a wide fan, the M18 crossed 200 yards of exposed field and dropped behind a low stone wall bordering a farm track. Elapsed time from shot to cover, 11 seconds. The Tiger's turret reached the hedgerow 4 seconds after the Hellcat left it. The 88 fired into empty brush. From behind the stone wall, the gunner had a new angle, now looking at the second Tiger's rear quarter, where the engine deck's 40mm armor plate offered about as much resistance as a car door. The second round punched through the engine compartment and set the Maybach on fire. 2 kills from 2 positions in under 90 seconds, and the Hellcat hadn't occupied either position long enough for return fire to find it. The third Tiger's commander made the decision to reverse back onto the paved road. Reversing a Tiger on pavement required the driver to watch his mirrors. Mirrors that vibrated so badly at speed, they showed little more than smeared color. The tank backed into a drainage ditch at the road's edge, canting 15 degrees to starboard, immobilizing itself as effectively as any American shell could have. Gruning's crew put a round through its side plate from 500 yards as it sat wedged in the ditch. The crew bailed out, 3 Tigers and 3 minutes. 1 M18. The fourth kill came 90 minutes later and a mile farther east, where a lone Tiger from the brigade's reserve platoon had taken up a hull-down position behind a collapsed barn foundation. This one had a competent crew. They'd positioned with only the turret exposed, frontal armor facing the most likely American axis of approach, a textbook defensive setup against any vehicle fighting by conventional doctrine. The Hellcat didn't use the likely approach. It looped south through an orchard. The 704th's operations report notes, fruit trees, probably apple, with the deadpan specificity of a unit that documented everything, and emerged 300 yards behind the Tiger's position. The crew never traversed. The round entered through the rear plate at a nearly flat angle, 4 Tigers in a single afternoon, from a vehicle with armor a rifle bullet could threaten. The 704th Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel James Grunewald, summarized the day's action in language that reads more like a racing team's debrief than a combat report. Speed of displacement between firing positions exceeded enemy ability to acquire and engage. Vehicle was never under aimed fire at any point during the action. That sentence, buried in a routine daily summary, never intended for publication, captures the entire M18 design philosophy, validated in 4 rounds of 76mm ammunition. Bruce's race car with a cannon had done exactly what the specifications demanded. The Tigers never adapted because adaptation required time, and time belonged to the faster vehicle. Cordite hung in the fog like a second ceiling, sharp enough to taste at the back of the throat, mixing with the diesel smoke rolling off 4 separate pyres spread across a mile of Lorraine farmland. The first Tiger still burned hottest. Ammunition cooking off inside the hull sent tracers corkscrewing through the open hatches every few seconds, bright orange lines scratching the gray air before tumbling into the mud. 40 minutes had passed since the first 76mm round left that Hellcat's tube. In those 40 minutes, the entire tactical vocabulary of German armored warfare, frontal armor superiority, massed firepower, the psychological weight of a 57-ton Predator grinding toward your position, had been fed into a shredder built from speed and geometry. The M18's crew sat behind the orchard, where the 4th kill had happened, engine ticking as it cooled, the loader pulling spent brass casings from the turret basket and tossing them into the mud. 4 casings, 4 Tigers. The math carried a kind of obscene efficiency that no pre-war procurement board could have predicted when they approved a vehicle most tank officers didn't want. What the German survivors carried away from that morning mattered more than the burning wreckage. Crews from the first 3 Tigers, who'd bailed out and stumbled west through the fog, reached Panzer Brigade 111's command post by mid-afternoon. The interrogation summaries compiled after the brigade's eventual surrender, fragments preserved in the 704th's intelligence annexes, described crews unable to agree on what had hit them. One gunner from the 2nd Tiger reported at least 3 enemy vehicles, firing simultaneously from different positions. His loader insisted only 1 vehicle had fired, because the interval between shots matched a single gun's reload cycle. The commander of the 3rd Tiger, the one who'd reversed into the drainage ditch, told his debriefers he'd heard the engine sound of something lighter than a Panzer, but faster than anything wheeled, and assumed it belonged to an armored car conducting reconnaissance, not a vehicle capable of killing his tank. He described ordering his driver to reverse because he believed the real threat lay ahead, where the column had been heading. The shot that killed his Tiger came from behind and to the right, a direction he'd classified as secure 30 seconds earlier. Gespenst, one of the crew reportedly called it during the debrief. Ghost. The declassified interrogation file doesn't attribute the word to a specific individual, and the translation may carry more drama than the speaker intended. But the sentiment threaded through every account. An enemy they couldn't see, couldn't track, couldn't hold in one place long enough to return fire. An enemy that fought like smoke with a cannon. Lieutenant Colonel Grunewald's after-action report tallied Company C's ammunition expenditure for September 19th at 11 rounds of 76mm, 4 of which produced the Tiger kills, the remaining 7 directed at Panthers and half-tracks during the broader engagement. 11 rounds. A full combat load for an M18 ran 45 rounds of main gun ammunition. Company C used less than a quarter of one vehicle's loadout to account for 4 of the heaviest tanks the Wehrmacht fielded. No amount of German engineering could close that gap, because the gap wasn't engineering. It was a tactical doctrine that treated the vehicle as a delivery system for position rather than firepower. A platform whose primary weapon wasn't its gun, but its ability to be somewhere else by the time the enemy reacted. Bronsart von Schellendorf's brigade lost 26 armored vehicles on September 19th and 20th combined, against American losses of 3 Shermans and 0 tank destroyers. The colonel himself survived the battle, but not the war. His unit ceased to exist as a fighting formation within 72 hours of first contact at Arracourt. Its remaining Panthers parceled out to other units as individual replacements. The 704th's Company C rotated to a rest area 2 miles behind the front line on the evening of September 20th. Gruning's crew, or whoever crewed that particular Hellcat, spent the evening cleaning mud from the vehicle's torsion bar suspension with borrowed infantry entrenching tools. The maintenance log notes the work took 3 hours. It does not mention the 4 Tigers. Colonel Bruce Clark pushed his Combat Command A forward at dawn on September 20th, and the fog that had sheltered the 111 Brigade the day before turned against its survivors. CCA's Shermans and the 704th's remaining Hellcats advanced on parallel axes 300 yards apart, close enough for mutual support, far enough that a single ambush couldn't catch both columns. Clark had read Grunewald's after-action summary from the 19th. He understood what the M18 could do when given room to run, and he gave it room. Combat Command B, under Lieutenant Colonel Grunewald's coordination with the 4th Armored Division's operations staff, swept north to cut the Chateau Salin road and trap whatever remained of the 111 Brigade between 2 American forces moving at speeds the Germans hadn't planned for. Panzer Brigade 113 arrived that same morning to reinforce what 5th Panzer Army headquarters still believed to be a viable offensive. The 113's commander drove his Panthers straight into CCA's flank guard without reconnaissance. The division operations log notes contact at 0945, less than 2 hours after the brigade crossed its line of departure. Clark's tank destroyers repeated the pattern from the previous day. Flanking shots into side armor from positions the Panthers hadn't scouted, displacement before return fire, reappearance from angles that forced the German crews to traverse through 120 degrees or more. The 113 lost 14 Panthers before noon. Its commander pulled the remnants back behind a tree line east of Coincourt and radioed 5th Panzer Army that he faced an armored force of at least brigade strength, employing unusually mobile anti-tank weapons. He estimated American strength at 3 times its actual size. CCA fielded roughly 50 armored vehicles that morning across all types. The German report guessed 150. The same multiplication factor, 3 to 1, sometimes higher, echoes through every German assessment of Arracourt. FMS manuscript B793 contains a passage where Bronsart von Schellendorf's operations officer attempts to reconstruct American dispositions from memory during his post-war debriefing. He places tank destroyer units in locations where none operated, invents a 2nd battalion of Hellcats that didn't exist in the 4th Armored Division's order of battle, and attributes coordinated flanking attacks to at least company-strength formations that the 704th's records show consisted of 2 or 3 vehicles acting independently. The speed created phantoms. A single Hellcat, firing from 4 positions in 10 minutes, registered in German tactical reporting as 4 separate vehicles. Multiply that illusion across 11 days of continuous contact, and the 111 and 113 brigades fought a battle against an American force that existed partly in their own confusion. The numbers from those 11 days carry their own weight without commentary. 86 German armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, armored half-tracks. 25 American vehicles lost, mostly Shermans hit during the close-range engagements, where fog collapsed firing distances to under 200 yards and speed couldn't compensate for thin armor. 0 Hellcats from the 704th appear on the 4th Armored Division's permanent loss roster for the Arracourt engagement. The vehicle designed to be expendable, the one with half-inch armor that everyone from Army Ground Forces Command to the tank school at Fort Knox had called a death trap, survived a battle that chewed through Panthers at a rate of nearly 8 per day. Clark received the Distinguished Service Cross for Arracourt. Grunewald received a Silver Star. Gruning, if he commanded that Hellcat on the 19th, and the records remain ambiguous, received nothing beyond a unit citation, shared with the rest of the 704th. The Army's awards process favored officers and named actions. Enlisted crews who did their killing from vehicles identified by bumper numbers rather than personalities tended to disappear into the battalion's collective record. The 704th's morning report for September 30th, 11 days after first contact, lists the unit's operational vehicle count at 92% of authorized strength. Maintenance, not combat, accounted for the missing 8%. thrown track links, worn brake bands, a Continental R975 radial engine that burned oil and needed its cylinder heads retorqued every 200 miles, the mundane erosion of hard use on bad roads. German shell fragments hadn't touched them. 5th Panzer Army's intelligence summary for early October 1944 downgraded offensive operations in the Lorraine sector from feasible to inadvisable without significant reinforcement. The reinforcements never came. Bronsart von Schellendorf sat in a canvas chair behind a farmhouse basement wall near Chateau Salin on the morning of September 22nd, dictating his final situation report by candlelight because the generator had run dry of fuel 12 hours earlier. The brigade's signal officer typed with 2 fingers on a machine missing its ribbon advance lever. He fed the ribbon by hand after each line, a detail preserved in the document itself, where every third line prints lighter than the others. The report listed Panzer Brigade 111's remaining combat strength at 9 operational armored vehicles. 9. The unit had crossed its line of departure 4 days earlier with roughly 60. Panzer Brigade 113 fared worse by a margin that barely matters at those numbers. Its commander reported 7 operational Panthers on the 22nd, down from approximately 45 at full strength. Both brigades had burned through their infantry complements in dismounted actions that had nothing to do with armored warfare. Panzer Grenadiers thrown into hedgerow, fighting without vehicle support because the vehicles no longer existed. The 113's Panzer Grenadier Battalion took 41% casualties in 72 hours. OKW's records list the cause as combined arms action by enemy armored forces of unexpected tactical mobility. That phrase, unexpected tactical mobility, appears in 4 separate German after-action documents from the Lorraine sector between September 21st and October 3rd. Nobody on the German side could bring themselves to write what it actually meant. They got outrun by something they couldn't identify, and it killed them while they searched for it. The interrogations started in late September at a temporary POW processing facility near Nancy. Military intelligence service teams worked through captured crewmen from both brigades over a period of roughly 2 weeks. The interrogation logs run to several hundred pages, most of them routine biographical data and unit identification. But scattered through the procedural boilerplate, certain responses stand out. A Feldwebel from the 113th Second Company, asked to describe American armored vehicles encountered during the battle, listed Sherman tanks, armored cars of unknown type, and at least 2 types of fast tank destroyer, one very low to the ground. There existed exactly 1 type of American tank destroyer at Arracourt, the M18. His 2 types reflected encounters with the same vehicle from different angles at different speeds, turret visible in one engagement, hull down with only the gun tube exposed in another. A lieutenant from the 111's Tiger Company offered a more precise observation that the MIS interrogator flagged with a marginal note. Subject states enemy TD accelerated from stationary to full speed in approximately 4 to 5 seconds, which subject considers impossible for a tracked vehicle and attributes to faulty memory under combat stress. The lieutenant doubted his own eyes. The M18's actual 0 to 20 acceleration clocked at roughly 5 seconds on hard ground. His memory worked fine. His framework for what a tracked vehicle could do didn't include the answer. Hitler's Lorraine counteroffensive, the operation that was supposed to smash Patton's extended flank and buy time for the West Wall defenses to solidify, ended not with a dramatic cancellation order, but with a logistics spreadsheet. Army Group G's quartermaster calculated replacement vehicle requirements for the 2 shattered brigades at 68 Panthers and 12 Tigers. German tank production in September 1944 ran approximately 300 Panthers across all theaters. Allocating 68 to rebuild 2 brigades that had lasted 4 days meant pulling nearly a quarter of monthly Panther production from the Eastern Front and Italy, from the defense of the Reich itself. The request went to OKW. OKW sent 11 Panthers and 0 Tigers. Both brigades received orders to dissolve, their surviving crews and vehicles absorbed into existing divisions as individual replacements. The 111 ceased to exist on October 15th. The 113 followed on October 22nd. Their war diary files end mid-sentence in some cases, entries that simply stop, the clerk reassigned before finishing the page. Bronsart von Schellendorf transferred to an infantry division on the Eastern Front in November. He died near Breslau in February 1945. The circumstances fill no official report that survives. Gruening, or the man who crewed that Hellcat on the morning of September 19th, drove his M18 into Germany the following spring with the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. The unit's final after-action report, dated May 1945, lists total claims of 61 enemy armored vehicles destroyed across the European campaign. The 4 Tigers from Arracourt appear on page 3, line items in a table, identified by date and grid coordinate. No names attached. The Continental radial in that Hellcat had its cylinder heads retorqued 114 times between Normandy and the Elbe. Somewhere outside Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, in the spring of 1946, a captured Tiger, one sat on a concrete pad with its turret traversed 90 degrees to the right, a positioning required for the crane that would eventually lift it onto a flatbed truck bound for the scrapyard. Rain pooled in the open commander's hatch. Rust had already started eating the Zimmerit paste on the hull sides, giving the armor a leprous texture that caught the light in patches, gray flaking to orange, 68 tons of Krupp steel, dissolving one molecule at a time into the Maryland weather. Across the proving ground, an M18 Hellcat sat in an equipment lot awaiting disposal, its Continental radial pulled for rebuild, the empty engine bay filling with rainwater and dead leaves. Both vehicles had reached the same destination. One had taken 4 years, 11,000 miles of logistical pipeline, and the entire productive capacity of the Henschel factory at Kassel. The other rolled off the Buick assembly line in Flint, Michigan, in about a third of the time, at roughly a fifth of the cost, using an engine designed for aircraft that Buick's engineers adapted to a tank chassis because it happened to fit. FMS manuscript P-0-5-9, compiled in 1947 by General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, Balk's Chief of Staff during Army Group G's Lorraine operations, contains a passage about American armored tactics that reads like a man trying to explain a magic trick he watched from 10 feet away and still can't reverse engineer. Von Mellenthin called American tank destroyer doctrine wasteful of opportunity but devastating in application, a phrase that manages to be both a compliment and an insult in the same breath. He noted that German tactical doctrine assumed armored engagements would be decided by firepower and protection, the two variables the Tiger dominated. American forces at Arracourt introduced a third variable that German planning hadn't weighted: tempo of repositioning under fire, von Mellenthin's exact phrasing. He spends 3 pages attempting to explain why superior German gunnery failed to produce superior results, and his conclusion amounts to an admission that hitting a target requires the target to remain visible long enough for the gunner to complete his firing sequence. The M18 denied that window, not through camouflage or standoff range, but through raw acceleration. The brute mechanical fact that a 19-ton vehicle with 400 horsepower could change position faster than a Tiger's turret could track it. The production numbers tell the rest. America built 2,507 M18 Hellcats between July 1943 and October 1944. Germany built 1,497 Tigers across the entire war, Tiger I and Tiger II combined. The vehicle designed to kill Tigers outnumbered Tigers by a ratio that made individual engagements almost irrelevant. Even if every Tiger had achieved a 1-to-1 exchange rate against Hellcats, the replacement pipeline would have buried them. But the exchange rate at Arracourt ran 4-to-0. The expendable vehicle proved less expendable than the fortress. That's the cosmic joke buried in the wreckage across those Lorraine fields. Germany spent 4 years perfecting armor protection, building tanks so heavy they broke their own transmissions, so wide they couldn't cross most European bridges without engineering support, so fuel-hungry that their logistics tail consumed more resources than the tanks themselves. America looked at the problem from the other end and asked a different question. What if you just weren't there when the shell arrived? The answer weighed 19 tons and ran on aviation gasoline. It cost about half as much as a Sherman. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion mustered out at Camp Miles Standish, Massachusetts, in October 1945. The unit's personnel records transferred to the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, where a 1973 fire destroyed approximately 16 to 18 million Army personnel files. The 704th's records may or may not have been among them. The archives list the collection as partially reconstructed. Gruning service record. If that name belongs to the man who killed 4 tigers on a foggy morning in Lorraine, sits in a file that may be ashes or may be intact in a cardboard box on a shelf in a climate-controlled warehouse in North St. Louis County, waiting for someone to request it. Nobody has. The mess hall at Camp Miles Standish served cream-chipped beef on toast the morning the 704th processed out. The menu survives. The crew roster doesn't.